Welcome, Wargamers, to the mournful storms of the mortal realms, because today we are continuing our discussion of the Stormcast Eternals, and we're cracking open the newest chamber that has been unlocked for you and I as players to engage with, and that is, of course, the Ruination Chamber. Now, of course, I'm super excited to talk about this. This is kind of the theme overall of the two-player starter set Skaventide that came out that you and I get to play with when we start playing the game, but also the content of Skaventide, like the novel that introduces this next narrative arc, also features them quite prominently. I was not trying to bury the lead, so to speak, on the new material, but I thought we needed the context to understand the formation and the life of a Stormcast Eternal, from their forging to being assigned a storm host, a battlefield role, and how they go to war. Because the videos that we've done so far in this particular series are going to account for centuries of time. They do not age. And so they're going to keep living and fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting, and then being killed, reforged, and put back together again where they were. And they'll be in this cycle, like I said, for centuries. But as we discussed in our very first video, cracks began to appear in this system quite early on. Reforgings that didn't quite nail it. The Stormcast Eternals would come back different, with either weird, wild side effects or just a general loss of self and memory. This can make them an incredible liability to the Stormcast next to them, who, if you're in a locked arm shield and some guy starts going off and losing his cool, either in a blind rage or it just kind of stares off into the distance, because he's kind of losing his mind and he's just checked out, disassociated, I guess, it affects the whole unit. And so the question then becomes, right, what happens to these vaunted heroes of Sigmar? Because by definition, to be entered into the Ruination Chamber, you are a veteran of lifetimes of war. You are a perfected deadly weapon. But what do you do with them when this starts to happen, when they lose the self? They start losing why they do what they do. They become rageful, attacking automatons. And so today we're going to be talking about just that, the Ruination Chamber itself, as well as the units that you and I can play on the tabletop to represent this phenomena happening within the army. One thing I like to add up top here, if you're interested in starting a Stormcast Eternals army, because I am as well, we'll get to that a little bit here at the end, please consider using any of my affiliate links in the description below. You using those links keeps the channel ad-free, and every time you do, a tip goes in my tip jar to directly support me, my wife, our cats, the whole channel, and I am so thankful for each and every one of you. Also, if you're looking to play Stormcast Eternals more, go ahead and check out Goonhammer for all the tactics, model reviews, painting guides, that kind of stuff you'll need. Alright, so in the Age of Sigmar 4.0 starter set, or at least the two-player one, you have Stormcast Eternals versus Skaven. But specifically, a bunch of those Stormcast are of a part of the army called the Ruination Chamber, a new addition for all of us here. So if you are just jumping into AOS with that starter set, you're getting caught up with everybody else here. Now, our discussion begins in the Eye of the Storm. Right, in the first section of this series, this playlist, we mentioned the phrase Eye of the Storm is how Stormcast Eternals describe the reforging process from their point of view. They feel as though they are a lightning bolt hurling at the heavens, moving at intense speed, the idea being this is their soul being ripped back to Azir, and you want to land in the Eye of the Storm. That's what makes you reforge correctly, so to speak. However, as reforgings go on, that becomes harder to do. Almost like something is destabilizing. You start to kind of move around as you arc your way back towards this fictional or possibly literal storm. And the Stormcast Eternals, their internal dialogue for describing someone showing symptoms of this degradation are said to have, quote, passed the eye of the storm, end quote. Which is, we have these nice ways in our modern language of, kind of communicating something without communicating it, right? It's their equivalent of saying, that guy's not right. Something's wrong with him. But it's a polite way to say it because it's going to affect everybody at this point. So, passing the eye of the storm. Now, this can manifest in a lot of different ways, as we've mentioned, but the most common, by far, at least as explained in the new battle tome, is memory loss. Stormcast will be reforged, but with absolutely no memory of their mortal lives. more so than just kind of fading and chipping away. It's like a clean slate. And this event sets them on a course of mentally falling apart. I think it's because they lose kind of that firm foundation of their character, their values, their convictions, and so on, right? So once the soul loses that tether of memory, it starts to fray a little bit. It doesn't have a firm foundation. So sometimes in battle, these afflicted Stormcast will be inopportunely bombarded with memories that paralyze them. So let's walk through this. Imagine you are tasked with stopping a Khorne army, and one of your number just loses it halfway through the battle. Losing it could mean they start attacking friend and foe, because in his mind, he can't tell the difference between a Stormcast and a Khorne guy. He's having a delusion of some kind, possibly. Or they just freeze because they are eternally being racked in their mind and being bombarded with visions of the past that they don't really remember. And while it is less violent, you don't want either of these afflictions to affect your buddy if you have to stand next to them in a shield wall. So you start to have these Stormcasts that just become highly ineffective because their minds are fraying from memory loss that's causing all kinds of things. We can't use them to fight in the same way that they used to, even though they're veterans at fighting in those particular kinds of formations. It's quite a conundrum. And the idea that we get from this battle tome is that this problem just kind of slowly became more and more prevalent as things went on. We know Sigmar dispatched the Sacrosanct Chamber in 2nd edition to go find a solution. What we learn in this battle tome is that they failed. Unequivocally, they failed. And in their absence, the issues with reforging only grew. And we knew that a little bit. We knew when the Sacrosanct Chamber was sent out, there was little lore blurbs in that arc where that things had slowed down for the reforging process. So now the attrition game was kind of not there for the Stormcast in the grand sense. And so problems just kind of kept escalating, right? It kept snowballing a bit. And in the first Stormcast to utter the plan that would become, quote, the plan, was Ionis Cryptborn. He is actually a Lord Relictor, sort of the duties responsible for keeping the purity and the health of a Stormcast chamber. He is of the Hammers of Sigmar, and we actually met him in 1st edition when this whole thing first started. Him and Vandus came through the gates together. And while Vandus's, we'll say, light has faded as he's kind of gone more insane, Ionis has really come to his fruition and risen above the other Relictors, because he lays out this plan for Sigmar. And I'm not going to lie to you, the book, it lays it out in a very, there's a lot of extra words, a lot of kind of pretentious language. I'm going to just explain it very simply. The Ruination Chamber existed before this as a way of just basically having a space for in case things go wrong, right? In this exact scenario, hey, there's a few Stormcasts that aren't quite reforging right, and they have to kind of find a new way to fight. We'll put them over here, and then we'll have dedicated people come up with plans for that. Okay, future-proofing. Love it. Ionis wants to repurpose the Ruination Chamber. It is no longer the island of misfit toys. This is the old folks' home. A repository that is not just for broken souls, which, of course it used to be, but a place that's about easing the suffering of people who are losing themselves because of lifetimes of dedicated service. So you want it to be something good, something caring, something that honors their sacrifices and their deeds, but also needs a structure because they are losing their minds. His plan is to, rather than just dumping Stormcast in there, let's restructure a little bit, and we're going to form this into armies. Again, cannot stress this enough. Reclusians and all those things in the Ruination Chamber are veterans by definition, so they're very capable. We're going to repurpose some citadels and storm keeps that we have, and we're going to rename them as Bleak Citadels, which probably doesn't help the marketing for Stormcast to feel happy, and form them into units that still emphasize their incredible martial power, but are designed to keep these heroes fighting as long as possible, and give them basically a final death in honor once they are done. What we're describing, it was initially meant to be like an offshoot. Like I said, the island of misfit toys. Ionis has now decided, no, this is our retirement plan. When it gets to a point where you might be, one or two more reforgings might actually break you to the point where we need to put you down, you go to the Reclusian Order or any other part of the Ruination Chamber. And these chambers have their own traditions, their own beliefs. Again, the book Skaventide that kind of came with this edition does a really good job, I feel like, of nailing the tone of the Ruination Chamber, which is, it's a somber death tone, but at the same time, it's like a hallowed good type thing. These are ancient heroes. These are vaunted souls. We honor them, as opposed to a lot of the death imagery is kind of dark, and Nagash makes everything feel pointless because all is Nagash. This is sort of a honorable version of that. Now, one thing I'd like to insert in this video is that I'm scripting a fuller video on the god of Morda, of Garden of Moor fame from the terrain you might know from the past. Now, there's not a ton of information here in this book, but essentially the Battle Tome asserts clearly that even though Nagash went and trashed all other competing gods of death in Shyish, he either missed one or at least part of one. Moor was M-O-R-R, was a character from the old world, and they've kind of brought that character's name and, I guess, imagery forward into AOS with Morda, M-O-R-R-D-A, minor death god. But where Nagash seeks to enslave and control, Morda is about the peace of death, ushering souls gently to an afterlife and kind of comforting pained souls with oblivion. Cold, but generally benevolent to mortals. The reason I talk about all this stuff with death and Morda and inject it here is because the Ruination Chamber reveres this long-forgotten deity, as they believe Sigmar had some hand in their survival. There are some units or chambers that revere Morda equally with Sigmar, simply because they view themselves as somewhere between life and death, right? Where you are alive, Sigmar is your god, but once you pass, Morda is. And since they straddle the line, they perceive both. And there really wasn't any other good place to kind of inject that, but a lot of the imagery, a lot of the text that you see like scribbled on their shields and stuff is all about Morda. They're seeking a comforting, honorable death in combat that's going to set them free rather than keep this going. Personally, I like the inclusion of a death cult focused on peace and noble endings over, say, fanaticism and self-destruction and stuff like that. Like I said, I'm going to try doing a fuller video on Morda, but I just wanted to explain it because with the Ruination Chamber model specifically, the iconography is all over the place. And more, like more Griff, for example, it kind of plays into the naming conventions, so that's why it's there. And so we have these Stormcast not-so-Eternals, right? They've got maybe one or two reforgings left in them. And the reason I express that is because they are deployed somewhat sparingly, or at least they used to be. As this problem was accumulating, it used to be that this was a last resort and you would try not to risk souls, of such masters of war, but with the events of the Skaven Doom, that all changed. Instantly, battle erupted over the realms against every single bastion of order. Every soldier was needed. It was an all-hands-on-deck moment. Right? They're still there as a last resort. The problem is that more and more people are hitting that last resort button. But the Ruination Chamber will always respond when they are called. It's not a matter of bravery or anything like that. But what I love about that book Skaventide I mentioned is seeing the Ruination Chamber Stormcast interact with other non-Ruination Chamber Stormcast. They creep them out. Because first off, you have to remember, anyone who's not already in this chamber is looking at these guys. They see all the grim lamentations and the iconography of death, and they're looking at this and thinking, that's my future, if I'm lucky. And it just kind of hits a lot of the unspoken doubts and fears of Stormcast and Reforging, and it's fantastic. In fact, for that book, like I said, Skaventide, Gary Kloster, we follow a Ruination Chamber as they are called, like so many others, into battle, and we follow them through the eyes of a mortal who's accompanying them. And you get a great sense of how other people perceive the Ruination Chamber while you're learning about them yourself. These Stormcast are dark and cold, and they're reverent towards the Ruination Chamber. The mortals in the story are largely overjoyed because they cannot tell the difference, right? All they see is a bunch of metahuman saviors. They don't see the difference between the Ruination Chamber and these other guys, other than they don't seem to like each other too terribly much. But as they are hope when hope is dying, the Ruination Chamber has now been unleashed, and you and I get to play these units on the field and kind of take part in the undoing of Sigmar's great work. And so that's the little sum up of what the Ruination Chamber is conceptually. A few other last little notes here. Of course, every single Storm host is going to have access to one. If you would like to write your own lore, just make up a new Bleak Citadel and boom, you are good to go. And with that intro to the chamber out of the way, we're going to start tackling the units, right? The things that you and I actually put on the table to tell these stories about these really cool, crazy Stormcast. And luckily, since they're all new kits and kind of the highlight of the edition, there's a little bit more to chew on here, so it'll be a tiny bit less of a highlight reel than the last video. Because these units give us some real insight into the structure and order of the Ruination Chamber through their unit lore, not just, the Grand Army meta lore. I'm going to ignore named characters because I want to make dedicated videos for them, but here are the heroes of the chamber. It begins at the top with the Lord Vigilant, part warden and part commander of the Bleak Citadels. Think of them as Lord Celestants of this very specific kind of army. But unlike Lord Celestants, these heroes have passed the Eye of the Storm a long time ago. But through strength of character or sorcery have kept themselves sane. So they're starting to show degradation. They really can't be put into the main armies, but they do have talents in leadership and can fight well. These are the warriors responsible for forming battle plans, giving orders to, for others to follow in turn, and they're also responsible for the ending of their chamber. So if a Stormcast should start to lose themselves, it's the Lord Vigilant who is going to order the final death. They worship Sigmar and Morda in equal measure, and some of them are gifted with creatures of Morda, meaning the Morgriff and the Griff Stalker. And one of the things that's kind of hard to articulate, but the book does a good job of it, is they intermingle the language of like priest and warden and gravekeeper, like prison warden and all this kind of stuff. So it's a mixture of I have to keep this rabble together while also falling apart themselves. Next up is the Lord Terminos, who is his right-hand man to the Lord Vigilor. This is essentially the God King's executioner. He exists for a single duty, to give the Stormcast Eternals their final death at the Lord Vigilor's command. It's often done as part of a ritual called the Crossing of the Last Threshold, where essentially the Lord Terminos will bring their sword down onto a Stormcast's neck, and instead of arcing back to his ear, their soul simply dissipates. Beliefs on what happens when a soul dissipates kind of run the gamut from chamber to chamber, right? Whether you run from oblivion to Morda's embrace, pure nothing, like a nihilism, there's a lot of different thoughts. But they also go along with the Ruination Chamber into the field. Firstly, to fulfill their duties, because remember, a lot of their symptoms really show up when they're in combat. So this is when the Lord Terminos might be needed to kind of finally put down some of these Stormcast. But also, they love going to war because it gives them a break from killing their brothers. They can take that rage out on something else. It's a grim duty, so it must be really nice to be able to go shoulder to shoulder with some of these guys and feel like a warrior, feel like brothers again. Below the Lord Vigilant is the Lord Veritant. Now, this is an existing unit that was around for a little while. Their job used to be rooting out corruption from the various bastions of order. They make fantastic interrogators, judges, and so on. And part of that is because they have a witch sight, right? And some of them will cover their eyes, others will burn their eyes out, but a Lord Veritant can hone their vision to see any hint of corruption, chaos influence, magic use, anything like that. Part of Ionis's grand plan for the restructuring going on in the Stormcast army was that they were repurposed to a more forward battlefield role with the development of this Ruination Chamber model. Now they provide the same function, but in an offensive role rather than a defensive internal, kind of judgment. These are Stormcast Eternals sent into the most hellish environments where chaos gods will try to trick them, project madness, cruel boys are trying to make people hallucinate with miasmas, arcane tricks from vampires, and the point is, in the worst environments of battle, having someone who can distinguish reality and illusion is big. Then, when the battle is over, every member of the Ruination Chamber is inspected by the Lord Veritant to ensure no corruption or brokenness, nothing started to develop in this particular last battle. This is one of the main characters we are introduced to in the book Skaventide, actually. Which site also enables you to see a main character. Little known fact. Next up is the Knight Azeros. Now this is again another role that was repurposed into the Ruination Chamber. These are essentially ambassadors of Sigmar, reforged from mortals who were once envoys, warrior delegations, and representatives. And they are essentially tasked with bringing Sigmar's light into the darkest battles, and that's in a very, very literal sense. Each one of them carries a lantern, which is a small mote of Azir magic within it. And anytime they go somewhere, it empowers Stormcast Eternals nearby, it illuminates the battlefield, it scorches away the skin of Chaos Worshippers, and if needed, they can actually huck that lantern at their enemies and it explodes, which is really, really cool. Makes me think of the Van Helsing light bomb. And they kind of play really hard into the hope when hope is dying thing that we'll see a lot, because they're flying above the Ruination Chamber, they're heralding their arrival, they act as intermediaries between them and other forces, and they empower Stormcast everywhere. So like, a Warrior Chamber guy is still going to be empowered by this lantern that helps everybody out. They can bridge the gap a little bit. Next up are the Prosecutors, and this is an odd one because they have been repurposed from the Warrior Chamber, specifically of the Angelos Conclave. And from what I understand from how I read the text of the book, it seems like there are still some Prosecutors in the Warrior Chambers, but at least for the bulk of them, and then of course for you and I as rules, we have keywords we have to follow, they were moved to the Ruination Chamber. And these are Sigmar's winged angels of war. They fly in, act as scouting forces, flanking armies. They're able to summon hammers and javelins out of lightning to their hands and hurl them at the enemy before diving in for the killing blow. And if that sounds extremely dangerous and suicidal, you'd be right, because they have the highest rate of ending up at a Ruination Chamber, because they just keep dying. Which is why, even if they exist in both chambers, I have no problem with that. Even if, you and I, rules-wise, can only choose one, that's fine. I have no issue with that. But it does make a great deal of sense that these guys would be the first ones in the Ruination Chamber, right? If anyone's going to be kind of glitchy, and if there's any problem with the reforging process, of course it's going to show up with these guys first. Now, all of that said, with this, revision of the Ruination Chamber, they have been accommodating. Oftentimes, the Bleak Citadels will have exterior cells with cage observation decks, so that prosecutors can sit out there and meditate between campaigns, almost like a rook for birds, is kind of the idea we're getting. Again, it's a prison monastery. And lastly are the Reclusians. These are the average or base infantry of the Ruination Chamber. These are storied heroes of 1,000 campaigns, so deadly, but so close to being lost entirely. Now, the Battle Tome says very little about this unit other than their Stormcasts that are followed around by their squires called Memorians. And they go out and they, fight their foes and will eventually meet their inevitable destruction on their own terms. But the book, the Battle Tome itself, doesn't describe what the Memorians do very well. For that, I cannot recommend enough reading Skaventide, as mentioned before, Gary Kloster. The main character of that story is inducted as a Memorian to be one of these Reclusians. Now, I'm not going to do any spoilers on the book, except to tell you, the role of a Memorian within the army. When a Stormcast begins to lose their memory and their sense of self, if there is a living relative of that Stormcast, or maybe a family that used to serve them in their mortal lives, something like that, they can be brought into the Memorian order. Essentially, these are reminders for their Reclusian, tying them back to their humanity by telling the Stormcast's story back to them. Hello, we'll give an example with a well-known Stormcast character, Gardas. Hey Gardas, you were in this village when you died. You were married to this person. You were a healing priest of Sigmar. Nurgle's rot came through the town. and try to get to jog their memory of like these horrific events to try and give their mind some foundation. Now, what a Memorian is, like in relation to the Stormcast, can be very, very different. It could be like, a great-great-great-granddaughter who's recruited to serve, a family member that was taken centuries ago. It could be, if the Stormcast in their mortal life was a knight, maybe they actually had a squire household assigned to them. We'll just take one of those guys, right? Our families are duty-bound to each other. Not only do Memorians remind Stormcasts of what they were before all this, but in combat, which is why they're an actual unit on the table, they suffer the pain and of memory on behalf of their charges. So, what I was talking about before, right, when we have the shield wall and one of the Stormcast starts to glitch out, he either flies into a rage because he's having visions of being killed by Khorne armies that aren't happening right now, or he freezes because the bombardment is such that his brain just kind of locks. Well, in this case, having the Memorian there and assigned to the Stormcast, whatever bond that they share or is imprinted upon one another, the Memorian suffers that instead of the Stormcast. So what this means is they are the spiritual shield for the Stormcast. And this happens a few times in the book with a few other characters. I'm not, like I said, no spoilers, but the Memorian will start to have visions that distract them, but that enables the Stormcast next to them to fight with absolute precision. Again, they are veterans of a billion wars. Like, they can do this. But that's why they need their own special unit. And so I was just a little bit blown away that the Battle Tome didn't really include that information, because that's vital to me, right? Why would you want a small, teeny little mortal to go with you into battle? It's because it makes them better at fighting. They have uses inside and outside of war, but that's the long and short of it. And so, kind of rounding out this video, let's ask the question, why is this cool? Why is the Ruination Chamber a cool direction for Stormcast? Well, for one, it's super dark, it's super emo, I'm really here for it. The Raven imagery of Morda is just fantastic. I like that so much more than the iconic, or the lion iconography rather, which I get. It's definitely a good guy thing, but the Raven is such a I don't know, I love it. If you want to understand this particular chamber, Skaventide rather, is a mandatory reading, fantastic book. But one of the things I love is that they're very relatable. And by that I mean, not only are they good at what they do, they're very confident in what they are there to do, but there's a sacred care to them that I appreciated in that book. The reverence, not in a weird way, like we've seen a lot of zealots and stuff like that in the last campaign series. This is much more of a somber kind of reverence, and I enjoy that vibe for heroes, especially when they have like a theme like hope when hope is lost, that kind of thing. Because now they're telling stories that have themes of sacrifice, like real sacrifice that matter. And while it is a morbid tone, it feels reverent rather than excessive. I think the models look fantastic. I was so overjoyed to hear that the Memorians have a much more firm role than just kind of toting around tokens or, because when the Battle Tome describes them, it makes them seem like they are, I don't know, just walking next to their Stormcast hero, talking them up like, you got this, chief, you got this in the bag. Like it's just a little guy nipping at your heels trying to talk you up, which sounds annoying. And then you read the book and you're like, wow, these guys are incredible. Personally, I thought it was all fantastic. If you have any questions about them, please leave in the comments down below. As I'm doing this initial lore series that I've written out for Stormcast, I'm going to be collating all the questions in the comments and then do an FAQ Stormcast video lore edition. So anyway, thank you so much for watching and hanging out with me, and I will catch you next time. Happy wargaming, friends.